of John, and if you've never read the Gospel of John and you haven't looked towards the end, we're near the end, okay? We're just a couple chapters before the end of the Gospel of John, and we've spent some time here, over the past several months, just taking our time, going through the text, trying to understand. And so here we are in John 19, verses 1 through 16. And it says this: Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to be crucified. Have you ever watched like a movie that it's really, you're not sure how it's going to work out. Maybe the hero's in trouble and it seems like against all odds, like he wins and you're like, yes, or maybe you watched your favorite sports team and it seemed like they were going to lose and then they pull out this victory. And then later on, you watch the movie again. Or you watch the game again. When you watch the movie the second time, do you think it's going to turn out differently? Do you like, "Oh man, I hope he wins again. Oh, I hope she makes the shot." All right? No, you don't do that. You might feel like the same kind of excitement, but you don't think it's going to turn out differently. And why? Well, it's because once you watch the whole movie, once you see the whole game, you have the context. You have the whole context. You know, for everything that happens, you know why it's happening, where it's leading to. It's funny because even though we would never do that, many people, including many Christians, will read the story of Jesus being tried and being beaten and being mocked. And they'll read it like they don't know the ending. They read it like Jesus is this victim, or Jesus is this underdog. That's kind of weird. He's neither a victim nor an underdog. We're supposed to know this, right? Like if you're not a Christian, or if you've never read the Bible, or it's the first time you ever have seen this story, you might be like, "Oh man, poor guy. Wonder how it's going to turn out." But what do we know from the very beginning of John? Who is Jesus? He is the Word made flesh. He is the great I am. He is the Son of God. He is never the underdog. He is not the victim. When we understand this, we read the story differently. We understand this story differently. It's not about the underdog unjustly victimized. Instead, if we actually understand who Jesus is, and we know the context, and we look at it, what can we see? Well, we can see instead of that, we see God's love for humanity on display. That's what it is. We also see God's rejection of the world's system of power, of everything that the world values. God is rejecting it. And he's rejecting it because Jesus is there, not exercising his power. He's just loving. If we understand that Jesus is not the victim, he's not the underdog, he is the Son of God, then when we read the story, what we see is we see grace poured out on those who've rejected Jesus, those who've neglected Jesus, those who've attacked him, even hated him. When we understand this, what we see being played out for us is the only way of salvation, the only way that we could be saved. And it's being provided by the only one who could. What do we see? We see the Almighty allowing people who think they're strong to kind of play their games. And what it's ultimately going to do, it's going to reveal their weaknesses. It's going to reveal the depth of their sin. What do we see? We see the Creator. We see the Creator patiently waiting as Pilate and the religious leaders squabble like children. We see the Good Shepherd. We see the Good Shepherd reaching out to Pilate, appealing to Pilate, not so that he will be saved from the cross, but he's appealing to Pilate so that Pilate can be saved by the cross. He's not trying to be saved from the cross. He's inviting Pilate to be saved by the cross. And what we see in this story, when we understand this story in its context, who all the players are, what we see is we see perfect love standing in the midst of raging hate. And this distinction is important. And we've seen it in the Gospel of John, we see it in the letters of John, this stark contrast between dark and light. The world, the kingdom. And the thing that some people miss is even though we see this presented, and we see it in really like in depicted very loudly here in this situation, many people, and sadly including Christians, think they can have the love that Jesus offers, but still live according to the world. They're attracted to what Jesus offers. You know, I've asked this question to people before. If you ever go to like Galatians 5, and at the end of the Galatians 5, you'll see the fruit of the Spirit. And you ask people, would you rather have a world that's marked by the fruit of the Spirit, or would you rather have a world that's marked by the works of the flesh, which are listed just above? Would you rather have a marriage or a family or a church or a community that's that's marked more by the fruit of the Spirit than by the works of the flesh. I've never had anyone say, man, that works of the flesh marriage, that's what I want. I want there to be a lot of bitterness and malice and, I want jealousy. I want all that in my marriage. Never heard anybody say that. They look at the fruit of the Spirit, they go, that's what I want. That's a better world. That's a better church. That's a better family. That's a better home. That's what I want. But here's the problem. They want the fruit of the Spirit, but they don't want to let go of the works of the flesh. They don't want to let go of the way of the world. They don't want to let go of what the world values, but they still want the fruit of the Spirit in their lives. What Jesus is saying, what we will later read in the writings of Paul and we'll read in the writings of John, what are we going to see? We're going to see that the world of sin and the fruit of the Spirit, they're mutually exclusive. You have one or the other. The more you have of the fruit of the Spirit, the less you have of the works of the flesh. The more you have the works of the flesh, the less you have the fruit of the Spirit. So many Christians, they want to try to find this safe kind of middle ground. I love Jesus, but I don't want to be crazy about Jesus because I still really like things that the world has to offer. I find comfort or I find security in living according to the world. And so they kind of want to find this safe middle ground. There really is no safe middle ground. As Jesus has said, you're either for me or you're against me. You cannot serve two masters. Oh, but we try. We try. Christians try, non-Christians try. In the 19th century, there was multiple utopian ideals that were put out there. They were ways to try to engineer societies and communities that were really marked by the fruit of the Spirit. They all failed. They continue to fail. They're continually being promoted even in our culture today, in our society today, in our politics today. But they all fail because they don't address this fundamental thing. It is the fruit of the Spirit, not the fruit of the human. It's not the fruit of the human heart. If you don't have the Spirit doing this work in you, you will not have this fruit. You will simply have your, best effort. They all failed. In fact, some of them have failed miserably. 19th century, utopian ideals. 20th century, the bloodiest century in world history. More people were killed in the 20th century through war and political violence than in the rest of history all combined. It's staggering that here we thought we were on the edge of utopia. Oh man, if we just are a little more educated, we get a little more progress, we embrace these ideas, this is what's going to happen. And it led to the bloodiest century in world history. What we see in this trial, we see the life-giving fruit of the Spirit in Jesus. And we see the poisonous fruit of sin. And they're right there, side by side. This story, again, it's coming at the end of the Gospel of John, near the end of Jesus' earthly ministry. Jesus has been illegally and unjustly arrested. And he's begun a series of, some people count up to 7 trials in front of both Jewish and Roman authorities. Now again, we should never see Jesus as this poor, unfortunate soul. Jesus has been saying this throughout the gospel. This is coming. It's where I'm going. The disciples don't understand it. The disciples are in despair. The disciples think they've lost. But Jesus is saying, no, this is why I came. I came to die for the sins of the world. That's why I came. And Jesus is shown throughout the Gospel of John as always being in control. It's like, but I'm doing it with the Father's will on the Father's timetable. I'm not going to do it because Mom was pressuring me to kind of reveal myself at a wedding. I'm not doing it because the religious leaders are trying to pressure me to take the lead, to lead a rebellion. I'm not going to do it because some of my disciples, no matter how hard I've tried to tell them my kingdom is not of this world, still think my kingdom is of this world. No. He's doing God's will, God's timetable. We also see in this story not just Jesus, who even presented here is the Jesus who is Lord and in control. We find Pilate. Pilate, torn between what he knows is right and what he knows is just and his own self-interest. How do I keep the peace without losing anything that I have, my authority, my fame, my influence? We have soldiers that could just be doing their job. It's not the first person they've whipped and beaten and mocked, and it's not the last. And then we have these Jewish leaders, religious and political leaders. And even though they disagree with much, they don't like each other even, they agree on this: they want Jesus dead. And so verses 1 through 3, here we see where Jesus is beaten and mocked. And it says Pilate orders the whipping of Jesus. It says, it's written like, it sounds like Pilate actually did the whipping. He didn't. He ordered it, and the Roman soldiers carried out. Now understand, the Roman soldiers don't necessarily hate Jesus. They don't know Jesus. They might have heard stories about him out there, but they don't really know him. To them, Jesus is just another failed rebel leader. Now, they might very much hate the Jewish people, and if they hate the Jewish people, then certainly they're going to hate somebody who thought he could lead them in rebellion. But they don't really hate Jesus per se. But something else is kind of weird going on here. The Romans hate the Jewish people. The Jewish people hate the Romans. But the Jewish leaders are using that hatred to have Jesus killed. It's kind of messed up. But when we live in a world that's dominated by the world, that's what happens. Here's what the Roman soldiers know. This is what their culture tells them. This is what their training tells them. The strong survive. And if the strong survive, the strong are superior. And to them, Jesus is weak. Jesus is a loser. He's not strong. If any, he deserves it. At best, if we give the Roman soldiers some sense of morality or ethic we would kind of put together with goodness, they might have been thinking well, you know what? We do our job. There's not going to be any more rebel leaders. Maybe they think like, for the good of these people, they need to stop fighting us. They need to just stop. But here's what we know. No matter how the Roman soldiers see Jesus, no matter how Pilate sees Jesus, no matter how the religious political leaders see Jesus, Jesus was not captured. He willingly came with them. Jesus was not defeated. Jesus is not pitiful. If we understand the context of who Jesus is, the Son of God, the Almighty, here's what we know. Jesus could have wiped out the entire Roman army with a thought. Didn't even need to lift a finger. With a thought. But he doesn't. Now I want you to understand, Jesus is not standing there like, have you ever had like when my kids were younger, I would let them they might punch me in the leg or in the shoulder. And there's always that day, right? You let them do it like, it's cute. They don't really hurt you. And then there's that day it hurts. And it's like, okay, we're going to a new game now. Like, we're not playing this game anymore. But before that, it's like, fine. And don't get in your mind that Jesus is somehow impervious to this pain. No. He feels every blow. He hears every mocking word. And although he has all power that could create a universe with a word, he does nothing. He shows love to those who think they are strong. Verses 4 and 5. Pilate gives his verdict. This is another example of kind of what happens when we try to do what's right and we try to mix it in with the ways of the world. I think Pilate in his heart thought, I'm going to do Jesus a favor. I'm going to try to get Jesus off. I'm going to try to get him released. Of course, he's still trying to save, Pilate's still trying to save his own reputation, his own position, but I'm going to try to get Jesus released, so I'm going to do Jesus a favor. And I'm sure if he had run by Jesus beforehand, I'm not sure what Jesus would have said, but if he'd have said, hey, Jesus, I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to have some Roman soldiers beat you. And they're going to beat you and they're going to mock you, and you're going to look so pitiful that, hey, you're going to get set free. The religious leaders, the Jewish leaders are going to go, all right, you've done your due diligence, let him go. He can't just do what's right, even though he gives his verdict, and his verdict is, there is no guilt in this man. What does he misread? What does he underestimate? He underestimates the depth of the Jewish leaders' hatred of Jesus. Would he have done things differently had he really understood? Not sure. But he has said he finds no guilt in Jesus. But even though he knows he's innocent, he has him beaten. Again, when we try to mix the fruit of the world, the fruit of the flesh, with the fruit of the Spirit, we come out with some pretty grotesque things. But again, if you're understanding this story correctly, it's kind of interesting, the verbiage, when it says, see, I am bringing him out to you. And then it says, so Jesus came out. It doesn't say someone led him out. It doesn't say they carried him out. It doesn't say they pushed him out or drug him out. It says Jesus came out. Jesus came out. And he's standing there. And if we don't get the context, what do we see? We see a man who's been whipped, who's bleeding, who's dirty and sweating and spat upon. He has a crown of thorns on his head. He has this thing that looks like a robe, but we know it's just another joke by the Romans. If we see this picture through world eyes, we see poor, pitiful, broken man. But if we know this story, we know this is the Son of God, the creator of the universe. What do we see? We see Jesus never more kingly than he is in that moment. Because he is displaying his love for all, including his enemies, while they're hating him, while they're beating him, while they're mocking him. He's never more kingly than when he's standing there. People, when we get these worldly kind of ideas about understanding, Jesus and the kingdom, people think like, when Jesus comes back and he's going to look like some superhero, and if you read Revelations, like he's going to have these super powerful I-beams. He's going to have flames that come out of his mouth. And we get this, finally, Jesus is going to wipe out all the bad guys. So let me tell you, I'm not going to ask you, does that make any sense? I'm just going to tell you, it makes no sense. If Jesus is saying in this moment, if God is revealing that my kingdom is about love and not the power of the world, the power to conquer, the power to destroy, if that's what it is 2,000 years ago, it's going to be that way forever. He's not going to suddenly go, all right, I was just using that love thing as kind of a setup. Now we're going to go crazy on our bad guys. It makes no sense. But a lot of us in our hearts were like, come on, Jesus, make a comeback. At least, do like the Old Testament. Give all those guys hemorrhoids. Do something. Make them have pain. No. He just stands there. And then, in verses 6 through 8, we see that the leaders demand that Pilate have Jesus crucified. And Pilate, doubles down. He said he's not guilty. But then the leaders say, but he's broken one of our laws, making himself the Son of God. The text tells us that Pilate's fear is heightened. It's actually the first time it kind of mentions fear, but it's saying his fear is heightened. Doesn't tell us why. And there could be a lot of reasons. The obvious reasons are like, okay, now this isn't going to be solved as easy as I thought. Pilate was working for the win-win-win. Like, look, I do some punishment of Jesus. The religious leaders feel better about themselves. Jesus is now humiliated. He'll never be taken seriously as a rebel leader ever again. Okay, took care of that problem. I hold on to my position, and Jesus gets to go free. Win, 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 win. But when they say this, he goes, no, it's not going to be that easy. Some people think that it's even more than that. It might certainly be that, but that it's even more than that. That when Pilate heard that he was making himself to be the Son of God, there's something Pilate knew. From his exchanges with Jesus, he knew this guy's not normal. This Jesus guy is not doing what most people do. He's not begging for mercy. He's not pleading his case. He's not, being defensive. In fact, he has said, like, look, my followers are not going to rise up against you because that's not what my kingdom's about. He knows he's different. And so when he asks him, where are you from? he's really asking him, like, what does Jesus think? Does Jesus think he's from God? When Jesus doesn't give him a response, first you might be like, oh, Jesus is being obstinate. He's really not. He had already told him. You go look back in chapter 18. Jesus has already answered this question. He doesn't answer it again. But why is Pilate asking? Pilate's asking because he's trying to say, Jesus, work with me here. I want to help you, but you got to give me something. And you're just standing there and not saying anything. Give me something so that I can either, do some other machinations or go back to the religious leaders, to the crowd. Tell me something. He doesn't do it. And here, in verses 9 through 11, again, we see this is not a broken, defeated man. Pilate says, don't you know who I am? Don't you know the authority I have, the power I have? And Jesus does this remarkable thing. In the midst of what's supposed to be his trial, he passes judgment on Pilate and on the religious leaders. When we see, again, in context, who Jesus is, this is amazing, but it also makes perfect sense. He says, look, Pilate, I know you're in a tough situation, but you're not as powerful as you think you are. And he doesn't absolve Pilate of all the blame, but he does say, someone else has a greater guilt. If he had said someone else has all the guilt, that'd be different. He says greater guilt. He's saying, Pilate, you're guilty. You're guilty of everything you know. He doesn't have to tell Pilate. Pilate knows. Pilate knows he's about to do something that's just wrong. And he's doing it because he's trying to protect his own position, his own influence, his own career. He's going to compromise. He's trying to live in two worlds. Jesus says, I understand, but you're guilty. But there's someone else who bears even greater guilt. Sometimes we get caught up in the details of the story, like, okay, who is that? Who is that? And, there's a lot of possibilities. Most likely, Jesus in this specific situation, when he says there's one, he's most likely talking about Caiaphas or Annas, the high priest. But the real main point of this is that this is Jesus passing judgment. And so we get Pilate here. And we get Pilate being like so many people. He sees the kingdom of love in Jesus. He looks at somebody like Jesus and he goes, if the world was full of people like Jesus, this would be a pretty good world. And then he thinks about the world he lives in, the world of like Roman politics, where you're constantly afraid that you might be offending the wrong person or you might be supporting the wrong person. You never know if someone is plotting against you, and he's having to deal with all of that while being in Jerusalem, in Palestine, where there's all the political things that are going on with all the religious and political leaders there. He looks at all that. He hears the cries, crucify him. He sees the lack of mercy and love, and he goes, a world full of Jesus is a lot better than a world full of people like that. But he still thinks he can kind of have it both ways. And if push comes to shove, which it will, he's going to reject the kingdom of Jesus. Verses 12 through 16, we see what another picture of what happens when the world just kind of has its way. And we see when people are trying to kind of borrow from the kingdom of God. They're trying to take certain things and use it, and it just, again, it produces these monstrosities. In a kind of a weird, ironic way, we think of the Romans as being all about justice. But here, Pilate, representing the Romans, is trying to show mercy, not simply justice. The religious leaders, who are supposed to be representing God, whose the very law is founded on love, they don't have any love, not for Jesus. But the leaders, they play on Pilate's fear of losing his job. They play on Pilate's fear of being seen by the emperor as a traitor. And this is what happens when the world, just kind of runs on its own. Two people who hate each other combine forces to have Jesus crucified. Pilate, to the very end of this story, he's trying to salvage his pride. He knows he's lost. He knows that he didn't accomplish that compromise that he was trying to accomplish. And so all he can do is jab at the religious leaders, at the political leaders. That's why he says a couple times at the end, "Behold your king." Because he knows that just makes them angry. Then we see in verse 15, we see what happens when again, the religious leaders, they're supposed to, be following the law. They're supposed to be in covenant with God. And even if they can kind of rationalize, we hate Jesus because Jesus is trying to destroy that covenant, even if they can rationalize that, this covenant is still based on God is our supreme ruler. But what do they say in verse 15? We have no king but Caesar. They've totally abandoned what they say is true. They are publicly stating their allegiance to Caesar instead of God. When we start mixing the world into what we think is righteousness, or try to take some of God's kingdom and mix it in to being controlled by the works of the flesh, we can say and do just about anything. Who knows where it will lead? They don't just reject Jesus, they reject God as their king. And they pledge allegiance to the Romans, who they considered unclean. And then we see the crowd. We see the crowd, and the crowd doesn't understand really what's going on. They don't necessarily know all the politics, and they might not understand the nuances of the law. But why does the crowd want Jesus dead? Probably a mix of reasons. It's a crowd. But ultimately, they trust their leaders. Or perhaps they just love to see violence. And what's weird about this, again, the monstrosities that are created, the Romans have oppressed the Jewish people for almost a century. The Jewish people hate the Romans. They hate when the Romans are killing their own. And here, they're demanding it. They are demanding that the Romans do the thing that they find an atrocity. They're demanding that the Romans kill one of their fellow Jews. But I don't want you to miss this. Throughout all of this, the perfect, all-powerful, loving Lord, He's right there. He's right there. Pilate and leaders, they can't see it. All they can see is their hatred for each other. They think somehow eliminating Jesus is going to fix this, and really it isn't. But they can't see the perfect, loving Lord because they're so caught up in the world. In these passages, we see the ugliness of sin on display. In the soldiers, the sin is dressed up. It might be dressed up as training, military culture, loyalty, duty. It's still sin. In Pilate, we see sin dressed nobly, in power, in riches. He tries to hide behind, I'm just keeping the peace. I'm doing what's for the greater good. But we know the truth. He's caring more about his own position and his own power than doing what's right. And no matter how nobly or richly sin is dressed, it is still sin. In the political and religious leaders, we see sin dressed up in religious clothes and using religious language, even citing Scripture. But what do we find? We find loveless legalism. Again, they might have followed Pilate's lead and thinking, we're just doing what's best for the people. But we know they're not doing what's best for the people as much as they're doing what's best for them. And that's why they ultimately will say, we have no king but Caesar. And then we see the crowd. Because sometimes, you know what? Sin is just dressed in common clothes. And what are they doing? The crowd is hiding in the anonymity of the mob. They're outraged, but they don't really know why they're outraged. Maybe they just see others being outraged. They're like, let's go. They're outraged. I'm going to be outraged too. Or maybe it's because the leaders who they trust have told them to be outraged. The ugliness of sin on display, dressed up in so many different ways. But we also see the love and power of the Son of God on display. While the world before him wrestles with each other, acts out their sin, the Son of God patiently and often silently just waits. Jesus holds back this power so that the world can see his love. What's the text tell us? 3 quick things. Jesus is Lord, regardless of what is going on in the world. Throughout the ordeal of the cross, don't read the ordeal of the cross as Jesus being this victim. Read it as Jesus displaying the perfect love of God. Sometimes when things go really bad, we're tempted to think like sin is somehow in control. Well, just remember, Jesus is Lord. We might not understand why bad things happen. The disciples didn't. But we always need to have faith that Jesus is Lord and God is in control. And when we do that, and as we grow in our faith, that enables us to be able to show his love in every situation. Because we're not worried about the worldly outcomes, we're worried that we can represent Christ well and display his love. Second, we must be careful not to hide our sin by dressing it up in different clothing. Don't be like Pilate, the soldiers, the crowd, the religious political leaders. Don't hide behind duty or even righteousness or anything else to say like this is, this is what it really is. If it's sin, it's sin. Something is not sin or is not a lesser sin just because we can describe it in nicer terms. And as we've said several times over our study of the Gospel of John, we need to treasure the kingdom, and we need to want God to remove all that works against it. That's what the cross accomplishes. When we believe and receive the victory that Jesus has over sin on the cross, we enter the kingdom. We can think of growing in our faith as becoming more like Christ, but we can also think of it as the sin removal process. Remember, more of one, less of the other. As we grow in Christ, God removes all that works against the kingdom. And I will tell you this, as we experience the kingdom more, as we experience His love, the more we will treasure it and the more we will work for it. That's why discipleship is kind of like, you get this snowball and you see the snowball going down the hill, at least in the cartoons, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. When we grow, we just want to grow more. Here's what we know from church history. Many Roman soldiers will become followers of Christ. Some people think the first is actually recorded in Scripture in the other Gospels when the centurion at the cross proclaims, "This is the Son of God." We also know from history that many Pharisees, many religious leaders will follow Christ. And the story that I wish were true, but I can't tell you the sources are reliable enough, but at least it's out there, that Pilate and his wife actually become Christians. Regardless if one or many, how is this different if Jesus doesn't display love throughout this whole thing? If He doesn't speak truth to Pilate, but also display love? In the moment, no one wanted to pay the price of doing what was right. All could claim they were doing their job. All could claim they were doing it for the greater good. But really, it had to do with either weakness or selfish ambition or the desire to hold on to power or self-righteousness or really just loving to hurt people that you hate. It's all sin. But don't miss that this ugly, hate-filled display of sin is taking place in the presence of the Son. The ugliness of sin is being displayed next to the beauty of Christ's love. Which kingdom is for you? Which world do you want to live in? What kind of community, what kind of church, what kind of family? One filled with the ugliness of sin, just waiting to create the next monstrosity in your life? Or do you want to live with the love of Christ and people who are being transformed to express that love more every day? I encourage you, choose Jesus. Let's pray.